The night that would irrevocably alter the destiny of the West was not merely dark. It was a living, breathing entity of shadow, a profound and absolute blackness that seemed to swallow the very soul of Rome. A bitter wind, sharp with the promise of a coming winter, whispered through the empty, cobbled streets of the ancient city, moaning as it coiled around the crumbling columns of forgotten forums and rattled the shutters of slumbering houses. This was not the Rome of triumphant legions or majestic emperors. This was a city slumbering fitfully atop the bones of its own glorious past, a place where shadows held memories and every stone seemed to weep with the blood of history. High above, a sliver of a new moon, pale and cold as a shard of broken bone, offered no comfort, its feeble light doing little more than etching the jagged silhouettes of basilicas and temples against the starless vault of the sky. It was a night for secrets, for deeds that required the blanket of absolute obscurity, and within the labyrinthine, echoing corridors of the old Lateran palace, a conspiracy of earth-shattering magnitude was unfolding in terrified silence. The air in these ancient, disused passages was thick and heavy, saturated with the cloying scent of damp stone that had known centuries of moisture, the faint, sweet smell of old beeswax from long-extinguished candles, and the dry, dusty aroma of crumbling parchment and neglect. But more palpable than any scent was the tension, a crackling, electric anxiety that hung in the atmosphere like a coming thunderstorm, making every breath feel labored and every whispered word a potential betrayal. This part of the palace was a ghost of its former self, a maze of cold, shadow-draped hallways far removed from the newer, grander halls where official business was conducted by day. Here, in the deepest, most secret heart of the complex, the shadows themselves seemed to watch and wait. Two figures, rendered anonymous by heavy, coarse woolen cloaks of a dull, earthy brown, the kind worn by common laborers or mendicant friars, moved through this oppressive gloom with a haste that utterly betrayed their supposed station. Their footsteps, though they tried to step lightly, echoed with a disconcerting loudness on the worn flagstones, each scuff and click a potential alarm in the profound silence. The taller of the two, though stooped in a feeble attempt to conceal his true height and bearing, moved with an innate, powerful grace, his shoulders broad and his stride long and purposeful. Even disguised as a pauper, he could not fully hide the instinctual posture of a man born to command armies and rule kingdoms, the way his right hand, hidden within the folds of his cloak, rested instinctively on the place where the hilt of a sword would normally be. His companion, slightly older and more visibly agitated, shuffled with a nervous energy, his head constantly swiveling, eyes wide and darting into every niche and alcove, seeing threats in every pooling shadow. He clutched a single, thick, leather-bound codex to his chest as if it were a holy relic, his knuckles white with the force of his grip. These were no mere paupers. They were the two most powerful men in the Christian world, engaged in a desperate, terrifying act of secrecy. Pope Leo III, the spiritual father of Christendom, and Charles, king of the Franks and patrician of the Romans, the great warrior king known to history as Charlemagne. Their flight to this forgotten wing had been precipitated by a conversation of such shocking intimacy and horror that it still hung between them, a shared specter that fueled their fear. Just hours earlier, within the secure, echoing solitude of the palace's most private chapel, illuminated only by the flickering red glow of a sanctuary lamp, Leo had finally shattered. The carefully constructed facade of papal infallibility had crumbled away, leaving behind a raw, terrified man. His voice, when he spoke, was a raw, torn whisper, cracking under the immense weight of the memory he was forced to relive. He had described it all to the initially skeptical king in graphic, shuddering detail. The sudden, brutal ambush in the sunlit street months prior during the traditional procession of the major litanies, the rough hands of his political enemies, the noblemen of the Lateran faction, grabbing him, their faces contorted with hate. He spoke of the cold, rough stone floor of the monastery of Saints Stephen and Sylvester where they had dragged him, of the overwhelming stench of fear and his own blood, of the hard, cruel hands holding his head down, the cold, sharp edge of a knife pressing against his eyelid, the searing, unspeakable pain as they tried to gouge out his eyes, the metallic taste of blood filling his mouth as they attempted to tear out his tongue. Their brutal logic being that such a mutilated, broken man could never again serve as vicar of Christ, could never again celebrate the holy Massachusetts. They believed, in their heretical arrogance, Leo had hissed, his own, miraculously healed eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fervent, fanatical belief. That the eyes and the tongue were the sole vessels of God's power on earth. They thought they could steal the divine right from me, that they could physically tear the sanctity from my body. They failed. God restored me, a miracle to show His favor, but they are still out there. They are here, in this very city, in this very palace, Charles. They watch. They wait. They will try again, and next time, they will not fail. My guards are not to be trusted. Your own are strangers here. We are surrounded by shadows that wish to consume us both. Now, their journey through the palace's bowels felt like a descent into the underworld itself. They reached a nondescript, low oak door, blackened with age and studded with iron bolts that were red with rust. It looked like a door to a cellar, long forgotten. Leo produced a heavy, tarnished iron key from a cord around his neck, his hands trembling so violently that the metal scraped and scratched against the inside of the ancient lock before he could steady himself enough to turn it. The mechanism groaned in protest, a loud, grating shriek that seemed to tear through the silence like a physical thing, causing both men to freeze, their hearts hammering, listening for any sound of discovery. When only silence answered, Leo pushed the door open, and a wave of even colder, damper air washed over them, carrying with it the smell of old dust, decay, and something else, something metallic and faintly ozonic, like the air after a lightning strike. The room beyond was a small, circular scriptorium, a monk's copying room from a bygone era, now utterly abandoned. Rotting desks lined the walls, their surfaces furred with grey dust, and the shattered remnants of clay ink pots littered the floor like ancient bones. In the very center of the room, a single three-legged stool stood beside a simple wooden reading stand, and upon that stand rested not a Bible or a book of hours, but something far older, far more alien, and infinitely more ominous. It was a heavy, thick tablet of dark, almost black stone, its surface cracked and crazed with age. Yet, upon closer inspection, those lines were not mere random fractures. They were meticulously, impossibly carved symbols, angular, geometric, and utterly unfamiliar, a language that had been dead and dust long before Romulus founded his city on these hills, before the Etruscans dreamed of their gods. This was the lapis imperii, the stone of empire, a relic so ancient its true origins were lost to all but the most esoteric myths, whispered by the most secretive of church fathers to have been found in a sealed, leaden box deep beneath the foundations of the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, a pagan heart placed at the pagan heart of the world, now hidden away by a line of popes who feared its power yet dared not destroy it. Leo's voice, when he found it, was barely a breath, filled with a dread that was almost reverent. "The text," he whispered, gesturing to the codex he carried. "The ones hidden even from the Bibliotheca Apostolica, speak of it. The ancient rites, the ones from before Peter, before Christ, from a time when men spoke to powers we have forgotten. They say this stone does not prophesy. It decides. It does not predict the future, it confirms the one who is worthy to shape it, the rightful ruler of the world. It shows a vision of the future it itself will help to forge. But to look upon it, it is not a gift, Charles. It demands a price. It shows truth, but truth can be a weapon that cuts the one who holds it. What it shows has driven lesser men to madness." Charlemagne, a man of practical steel and unshakable Christian faith, felt a profound, deep-seated unease, a holy dread of this blatantly pagan object. This was sorcery, idolatry. It belonged to the old world Christ had come to erase. Yet, beneath that, a colder, harder emotion stirred ambition. It was a relentless fire in his belly, the same drive that had pushed his armies across Europe, that had subdued Saxons and Lombards, that dreamed of a united Christendom under his firm, guiding hand. He had come to Rome to restore order, to protect the Pope from his venal enemies, to be a king and a patrician. But this ancient, dreadful stone promised something else entirely. An empire. Not just a kingdom, but a rebirth of Rome itself, with him at its helm. The temptation was a serpent, cold and compelling, coiling around his heart. "What must I do?" he asked, his voice low and steady, a rock of certainty betraying none of the spiritual turmoil that raged within him. "You must place your hand upon it," Leo instructed, his eyes fixed on the stone's unnervingly dark, non-reflective surface. unable to meet the king's gaze. You must ask. The question must burn only in your soul, the deepest, most secret desire of your heart. And you must be prepared, my son. You must be prepared to see the answer. Taking a deep, steadying breath that did little to calm the frantic beating of his heart, Charlemagne, king of the Franks, defender of the faith, took the final steps forward. He ignored the unnatural chill that radiated from the stone, a cold that seemed to seep into the very marrow of his bones. He ignored the way the shadows in the circular room now seemed to twist and deepen, stretching towards him like grasping hands. He raised his large, calloused hand, a warrior's hand scarred and strong from decades of gripping a sword, and with a final moment of hesitation that stretched into an eternity, pressed his palm flat against the cold, utterly unforgiving surface of the lapis imperii. For a single, heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. There was only the silence, the cold, and the crushing weight of anticlimax. Then, a searing, paralyzing cold, far worse than any winter he had ever endured on campaign, shot up his arm, a wave of ice that seemed to freeze the blood in his veins and lock his muscles in place. The strange, angular symbols carved into the stone's face began to glow, not with a holy light, but with a faint, sickly, pulsating green luminescence that seemed to eat the existing light rather than contribute to it, illuminating his face in the gloom with a ghastly, corpse-like pallor. His eyes flew wide open, his breath caught in his throat, trapped there by an invisible force. The stone was no longer stone, it was a window, a portal into a swirling, chaotic storm of images and sensations that flooded his mind not as thoughts, but as lived experiences. He saw not a glorious coronation in St. Peter's Basilica filled with light and song, but a shadowy, monstrous figure, featureless yet radiating pure malice, lurking behind the towering, magnificent silhouette of a throne that was his, yet was somehow corrupted, wrong. He heard the clash of steel, not in the open field of triumphant battle, but in the close, suffocating confines of a palace room. The screams were not of foreign enemies but of trusted friends, the wet, tearing sound of betrayal. He saw a landscape of fire and ash, where the great silver eagle standard of Rome was not held aloft in triumph, but lay broken and trampled into mud churned by the hooves of strange, nightmare horses. He felt the cold not of winter, but of a deep, cosmic emptiness, a void where God's light had been utterly extinguished, and in its place, a whispering, ancient hunger stirred, a consciousness so vast and cold it felt like the death of hope itself. And then, as suddenly as the visions had seized him, they were gone. The connection shattered. Charlemagne's hand was flung from the stone's surface as if by a physical force, the recoil sending a jolt of agony through his shoulder. He stumbled backward, his boots slipping on the dusty floor, and would have fallen had his reflexes not been honed by a lifetime of warfare. He caught himself against the cold, damp wall, his chest heaving, not with exertion, but with a soul-deep terror he had never known possible. The great king, who had faced Saxon berserkers and Lombard lances without a flinch, now trembled like a child awakened from the most vicious nightmare. His heart was a wild drum against his ribs, and his breath came in ragged, shuddering gasps that fogged in the suddenly frigid air. The ghastly green light from the stone symbols faded, dying down to a faint, malevolent ember glow before extinguishing completely, plunging the room back into a darkness that now felt alive, predatory, and thick with unseen presences. For a long moment, there was only the sound of his own desperate breathing and the frantic, thunderous pounding of blood in his ears. He could still smell the phantom odors of the vision, the coppery tang of blood on marble, the acrid smoke of a dying empire, the ozone stench of raw, uncontrolled power. Pope Leo III rushed forward, his own fear forgotten in the face of the king's palpable distress. He grabbed Charlemagne's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Charles, my son, speak to me. What did you see? In the name of God, what was shown to you?" His voice was a frantic whisper, torn between terror and a desperate, scholarly need to know, to document the unknowable. Charlemagne could not form words. His mind, usually a fortress of strategy and command, was a shattered ruin. The visions had not been simple pictures. They had been experiences, emotions, sensations imprinted directly onto his soul. He had not just seen a shadow behind the throne. He had felt its cold hatred, its ancient, patient malice, an intelligence that viewed his entire lineage, his entire nascent empire, as nothing more than a momentary flicker before a great and eternal darkness. He had not just heard the clash of steel, he had felt the hot spray of blood from a betrayed friend, a face he knew, a voice he trusted, strike his own cheek. The betrayal was not an abstract concept, it was a personal, intimate wound inflicted by a hand he had shaken in friendship. The void where God's light vanished was not a thought. It was a chilling certainty that had frozen his very faith solid. He opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. His tongue felt heavy, useless. He could only stare at Leo, his eyes wide with a horror that was far older than Christianity, a primal fear that spoke of things that lurked in the darkness before the first words of Genesis were spoken. This was not the divine confirmation Leo had promised. This was a curse. This was a window into a damnation he had not known existed. Leo, seeing the abject terror in the king's eyes, felt his own scholarly fervor curdle into panic. This was not the reaction described in the cryptic texts. The texts spoke of awe, of divine light, of a clarifying purpose. They spoke of the stone confirming a destiny, not unraveling a man's mind. He had expected a sign, a portent, perhaps a challenging vision to be interpreted. He had not expected to see the most powerful man in Europe brought to the brink of collapse by a silent piece of rock. "We must go," Leo hissed, his own voice trembling with a new, more immediate fear. The noise, the king's distress, if there were indeed spies lurking in these ancient walls, they would have been drawn to this place like vultures to a dying animal. "Now, Charles, we cannot stay here." He tugged at the king's arm, but Charlemagne was a giant, rooted to the spot by the sheer weight of his vision. His mind was desperately trying to reassemble the fragments, to find logic in the chaos. The throne was his, that much was clear. It was a Roman throne, but of a design he had never seen, more massive, more oppressive. And the shadow, it was not a man. It was something else. Something that wore a man's shape like a poorly fitted garment, its true form a shifting, oily darkness that promised an end to all things. The betrayal, the face. For a fleeting second, it had been clear. It was the face of a young man, fierce and proud, with eyes that held a familiar fire, a face that echoed his own, a face from his own bloodline. The realization was a second, colder dagger to his heart. His own line would betray him. His own flesh and blood would be the instrument of the darkness he had seen. This was the price the stone demanded. Not madness, but knowledge. The terrible, unbearable knowledge of his own inevitable downfall, orchestrated not by a foreign enemy, but by the very dynasty he sought to build. With a monumental effort of will that drained what little strength he had left, Charlemagne pushed himself away from the wall. He looked at the lapis imperii, now just a dark, inert stone again, and in that moment, he felt a hatred for it more pure than any he had ever felt for a human enemy. This object was a poison. It did not show a future that could be avoided. It showed a future that it itself would weave into being, a self-fulfilling prophecy carved in ancient evil. It must be destroyed. He rasped, his voice a dry, cracked thing, unrecognizable even to himself. Leo stared at him, aghast. "Destroy it? We cannot. It is a relic. It is a key to understanding God's plan for temporal power. It has existed since before. It is a thing of evil." Charlemagne interrupted, his voice gaining a shred of its former strength, fueled by a burning rage. "It does not show God's plan. It shows the devil's work. It shows corruption and betrayal and the end of all we would build. I saw it, Leo. I saw the end of Rome reborn. I saw my own blood turning to venom." His words echoed in the small room, seeming to be absorbed by the hungry darkness. Leo flinched, looking from the enraged king to the stone and back again. His life's work, his secret study, his belief that he alone understood the hidden mechanisms of power and divinity, all of it was being rejected in a storm of terror and rage. He had wanted to give Charles a gift, a secret weapon, a divine mandate written in stone. Instead, he had unleashed a demon in the king's mind. "We will speak of this elsewhere," Leo pleaded, his voice desperate. "This room is not safe. The walls have years older than either of us. Please, I beg of you, my king. We must return to the light." The word light seemed to break the spell. Charlemagne nodded stiffly, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He would not be conquered by a vision. He was a king. He would master this, bury it, lock it away deep within the iron vault of his will. He would build his empire in spite of the stone's vile prophecy. He would defy the future it had shown him. But as he turned to follow the Pope back into the labyrinthine corridors, the images were seared onto the back of his eyes. The shadow behind the throne was there every time he blinked. The face of the betrayer, that familiar, hated young face, lingered in his mind's eye. The cold of the void had settled deep in his bones, and he knew, with a certainty that was itself a form of torture, that this night, and the knowledge gained in it, would haunt him until his dying breath. The grandeur of the coronation he had perhaps vaguely imagined was now ashes in his mouth. Every triumph from this night forward would be shadowed by the question, was he building a legacy, or was he merely constructing the stage for his own eventual, prophesied destruction? The walk back was a silent, funereal procession. The shadows now seemed to mock them, and every distant echo of a guard's footfall, or the scuttle of a rat in the walls sounded like the approach of the faceless malice he had seen. Charlemagne was no longer just a king protecting a pope. He was a man who had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had not only stared back, it had shown him his own end, and the end of everything he loved. The crown, when it came, would not be a symbol of pure power. It would be a desperate act of defiance against the future he now knew was waiting for him, a future written in green fire on a black stone, a future he had to fight with every fiber of his being, even if the fight was already lost. The secret of his coronation had just become infinitely darker, and infinitely more terrible. The journey back through the serpentine bowels of the old Lateran palace was a descent into a different kind of hell, one not of fiery visions but of a silence so profound it was itself a scream. The coarse wool of Charlemagne's disguise, which before had been a mere inconvenience, now felt like a shroud, each rough fiber a reminder of the mortal frailty the stone's vision had so brutally exposed. He was a colossus who had felt the ground crack beneath his feet, a strategist who had seen the map of his future burn to ashes. Leo, ahead of him, moved like a ghost, his footsteps hesitant, his head constantly turning back not to guide the king, but to check the shadows behind them, his eyes wide with a terror that was now compounded by the catastrophic failure of his secret plan. He had sought to bind the king to him through a shared, sublime mystery, to become the indispensable architect of a new, holy empire. Instead, he had presented a Pandora's box, and the horrors that had flown out now hung between them, a chasm of shared dread that no words could bridge. The darkness of the corridors seemed to have thickened, becoming a viscous, almost liquid entity that pressed against them, resisting their passage. It was no longer an absence of light but a presence, a watchful, ancient sentience that had been awakened by their transgression in the scriptorium. Charlemagne's senses, heightened by decades on the battlefield where a snapped twig could mean death, were screaming. Every drip of distant water was the fall of a tear of blood from his vision, every sigh of the wind through a cracked window was the whisper of the faceless shadow promising ruin. The scuttling of a rat in the walls became the sound of conspirators, his own future betrayers, already scratching at the foundations of his world. He could still feel the stone's impossible cold deep in the marrow of the hand that had touched it, a permanent stain of ice that his own blood heat could not dissolve. It was a phantom limb now, connected not to his body but to that other, terrible reality of fire and betrayal he had been forced to witness. The face of the young man, his betrayer, was burned onto his mind's eye with the clarity of a master's portrait. He searched his memory, his court, his family. Was it one of his sons? Pepin, his namesake Charles, the young Louis? Their faces, so dear to him, now became masks behind which he was forced to imagine this nascent treachery. The love he felt for them warred with a new, poisonous suspicion. This was the stone's true evil. It forced him to distrust his own blood, to see the seeds of his destruction in the eyes of his children. It had not just shown him a future, it had infected his present, turning every loyalty into a potential lie, every affection into a future wound. They reached the slightly more inhabited, though still deserted, upper servants' passages. A sliver of pallid pre-dawn light filtered through a high, narrow arrow slit, illuminating dancing motes of dust like spirits in the air. In this faint gray light, Leo finally dared to stop, turning to face the king. His face was ashen, his lips bloodless. Charles, he whispered, the word cracking. What you said about destruction. We cannot. The lapis imperii it is a part of the world's balance. The texts are adamant. To destroy it is not to avert a fate, but to unleash a chaos far greater. Its existence regulates the flow of power. It is a keystone. Remove it, and the entire arch collapses. Charlemagne looked down at the frightened Pope. The aura of spiritual authority had utterly vanished, leaving only a desperate, superstitious scholar who had played with forces he could not comprehend. It showed me my death, Leo. The king's voice was low, a gravelly rumble devoid of its usual commanding resonance, filled instead with a weary, bottomless horror. It showed me the end of everything I have built, everything I will build. It showed me that my legacy is a cancer that will consume itself. It did not feel like a warning. It felt like a verdict. A sentence passed by a court older than God. He leaned closer, his immense frame dwarfing the Pope, and in his eyes, Leo saw not anger, but a raw, unadulterated anguish that was far more terrifying. It showed me the face of the one who will do it. A boy. A boy with my eyes, Leo. My blood. Leo recoiled as if struck, his hand flying to the crucifix around his neck. No, it cannot be. The stone confirms the worthy. It confirms God's chosen emperor. It would not show you such a blasphemy. What God? Charlemagne's question was a whip crack in the silence. The God we pray to in our churches? Or the old, cold gods who demanded blood on stone altars? That thing in there. He jerked his head back down the dark corridor. Is not of our God. It is of something else. Something that was old when Moses received the tablets. And it has given me a tablet of my own. He held up his still trembling hand. And it is written in the blood of my sons. The enormity of the king's confession seemed to finally break through Leo's own panic. He saw not just a shaken man, but a foundation of the world cracking. If the great Charles, the pillar of Christendom, believed his work was doomed from the inside, then all was indeed lost. His mind, ever the scholar's, began to race, scrambling for a solution, an interpretation, a loophole in the apocalyptic logic of the vision. Then we must change it, Leo said, his voice gaining a shred of desperate strength. A prophecy is not a prison. It is a possibility. A warning. You have been given a gift, Charles. A glimpse of the enemy's plan. Now we can thwart it. We can be vigilant. We can root out this corruption before it takes hold. Charlemagne gave a short, bitter laugh that held no humor whatsoever. How? By looking into the eyes of my own children every day and wondering which one will plunge in the dagger? By becoming a paranoid tyrant who sees treason in every shadow, thus creating the very resentment that leads to betrayal? The vision did not show me an external enemy, Leo. It showed me that the rot is already within. It is in my house. It is in my name. It is in me. He fell silent, the truth of his own words hanging in the air. The stone's genius was diabolical. By showing him the end, it had guaranteed it. The knowledge itself was the pathogen. How does a man live, knowing his love for his sons is the very thing that will nurture his future killer? How does he rule, knowing his every success is a step closer to a predetermined downfall? This was the price Leo's text had so glibly mentioned. It was not madness. It was a life sentence of unbearable knowledge. The faint light from the arrow slit was growing stronger. Dawn was approaching. With it would come the world of men, of politics, of ceremony. The secret, terrifying night was ending, but for Charlemagne, the darkness had only just begun. He had to reassemble himself. He had to become the king again, the leader, the unshakable Charles. He had to bury the terrified man deep beneath layers of iron will and public duty. He straightened his back, the movement causing the coarse wool of his disguise to scrape against his skin. The action was symbolic. He was forcing the king's mantle back onto his shoulders, though it now felt like a leaden weight. "We will speak of this never again," he said, his voice now flat, controlled, devoid of all emotion. It was a command, issued from behind a newly erected wall of ice. What happened in that room is a phantom. A dream brought on by fatigue and the miasma of that place. You They must perform their own act of surgery on the past hour, cutting it out of history. "But the coronation," Leo stammered. "The coronation will proceed," Charlemagne said, and a new, frightening light entered his eyes, not hope, but defiance. A grim, bleak determination. "It will proceed not because God has willed it, but because I will it. It will not be a celebration of divine mandate. It will be a declaration of war. A war against the future that things showed me. I will build my empire not in the bliss of ignorance, but in the full, terrible knowledge of what it may become. And I will fight that future with every breath in my body, even if the battle is already lost in some other thread of time. My reign will be my rebuttal to that stone." In that moment, Leo saw the true nature of the man beside him. This was not just a king. This was a force of nature. Faced with an abyss, he would not turn away. He would simply command the abyss to close. It was magnificent. It was terrifying. It was perhaps the only response that could possibly hold the darkness at bay. Nodding mutely, too overwhelmed to speak, Leo turned and led the way once more. The path back to the papal chambers felt shorter. The world of men was reasserting itself. But as they finally reached the door that would return them to light, safety, and the beginning of history, Charlemagne paused. He placed his hand on the doorframe, his gaze distant, looking not at the present, but at the decades of struggle to come. He had gone into the night seeking a blessing. He had emerged with a curse. And a purpose. The crown would be his weapon. The empire would be his battlefield. And every day of his life would now be a silent, secret war against the shadow behind a throne and a betrayal written in his own blood. The public coronation at St. Peter's would be a magnificent lie. But he would know. He would always know. The secret of his reign was born not in glory, but in a small, dark room with a black stone, and it was a secret that would shape the destiny of Europe for 1,000 years. The door to the papal apartments closed behind them with a soft, final click, a sound that seemed to sever them from the nightmare world of the scriptorium and seal them back into the realm of the mundane, yet nothing could ever be mundane again. The air here was warmer, scented with beeswax candles and the faint, sweet aroma of incense lingering from evening prayers, smells of sanctity and order that now felt like a thin veneer over a terrifying abyss. The change in atmosphere was as jarring as emerging from a drowning depth into blinding sunlight. It was a return to a reality that now seemed flimsy, staged, and utterly divorced from the profound, Lovecraftian horror they had just witnessed. Leo, his hands still shaking, immediately moved to a heavy sideboard, pouring 2 generous goblets of strong, dark southern wine from a silver pitcher with a rattling clatter that echoed too loudly in the hushed room. He thrust one into Charlemagne's hand, and the king drank it down in one long, desperate swallow, not tasting the complex flavors, seeking only the burn of alcohol to scour the phantom taste of ash and blood from his mouth, to melt the permanent ice that had taken residence in his bones. The wine might as well have been water for all the effect it had. The cold was spiritual, not physical. For a long moment they stood in silence, 2 titans of their age reduced to frightened men, listening to the sounds of the palace stirring awake, the distant call of a guard changing watch, the faint murmur of voices from the courtyards below, the ordinary sounds of a new day that felt like a cruel mockery of the cataclysmic shift that had just occurred in the foundations of the world. Charlemagne's gaze was fixed on nothing, his eyes seeing not the rich tapestries depicting saints and martyrs, but the ghastly green glow of the stone, the shifting, hateful shadow behind the throne, the heartbreakingly familiar face of his betrayer. He was a man trying to fit the universe he had known for 50 years into the new, horrifying cosmology he had just been shown, and the two could not reconcile. The faith that had been the bedrock of his life, the certainty of God's divine plan guiding his actions, now felt like a child's comforting story told in the face of an indifferent, or worse, malevolent cosmos. The lapis imperii was not a Christian relic. It was a pagan artifact, a thing of a darker, older world, and it had shown him a truth that his Christian gods seemed powerless to prevent. This internal schism was an agony worse than any wound he had ever received in battle. Leo finally broke the silence, his voice hushed and tremulous. "The coronation, it is scheduled for noon, in St. Peter's. The nobility, the clergy, your own retinue, they are all preparing. They expect a celebration, a unification, a new golden age. He said the words as if reading from a script for a play that had now lost all meaning. Charlemagne turned his head slowly, his neck muscles tight with tension. The movement was predatory, and Leo flinched under his gaze. "A new golden age," the king repeated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Or the beginning of the gilded cage? The first step on a path that leads directly to that thing I saw lurking in the shadows of my own legacy?" He began to pace, his restlessness that of a caged bear. The room, though spacious, seemed too small to contain the tempest raging within him. "Every word of the ceremony will be a lie, Leo. Every prayer a hypocrisy. They will speak of God's will, of divine providence. They will not know that their new emperor has already seen the rot at the core of God's plan. They will not know he accepts this crown not as a blessing, but as a weapon to fight a war against fate itself." He stopped pacing and stood before the Pope, his immense presence overwhelming. "The ceremony must change." Leo's eyes widened in alarm. "Change? Charles, it is the ancient rite of the Roman emperors, adapted for Christendom. It is sanctified by tradition. We cannot." "We can," Charlemagne interrupted, his voice iron. "We will. You will add something. A new prayer. A secret vow. One that only you and I will understand. A vow of defiance." His mind, the brilliant strategic mind that had outmaneuvered a continent, was already working, adapting, turning the ceremony from a farce into the first move in his new, secret war. "In the moment before you place the crown upon my head, you will ask me a question. Not the standard question of faith. You will ask me if I vow to be the shield against the coming darkness. You will ask me if I accept the crown as a burden of vigilance. You will use those exact words. The burden of vigilance. And I will answer I do. This will be our compact, Leo. Not with God, but with each other. A pact made not in a church, but in that hellish little room. This will be the true coronation. The public one is just theater." Leo was aghast. He was being asked to tamper with the most sacred political ritual in the world, to embed a secret, pagan-esque vow into the heart of a Christian mass. It was heresy. It was blasphemy. And yet, looking into the king's eyes, he saw the absolute necessity of it. This was the only way Charlemagne could psychologically endure the ceremony without screaming the truth to the heavens. It was a lifeline he was throwing to himself. It was also a way to bind the Pope to him in this terrible knowledge, to make Leo his co-conspirator not just in secret, but in the most public forum imaginable. It was an act of breathtaking audacity and profound desperation. Slowly, miserably, Leo nodded his assent. He had opened this box. Now he was compelled to follow its consequences wherever they led. The hours until noon passed in a blur of suppressed panic and meticulous stage management. As Charlemagne was dressed by his attendants in the magnificent silks and rich purple robes of a Roman patrician, he was a statue, his face a mask of regal impassivity. Inside, he was screaming. The weight of the robes felt like the chains of destiny. The admiring whispers of his men felt like the jeers of future generations. When they placed the heavy golden chain around his neck, he felt the phantom cold of the stone's touch. He was being dressed for his own execution, or worse, for his transformation into the architect of his empire's doom. Meanwhile, in the great Basilica of St. Peter's, 1,000 candles were lit, their light gleaming off golden mosaics and the jewels of the assembled nobility. The air throbbed with the solemn, majestic chords of the choir and the dense, expectant murmur of the crowd. Frankish knights standing shoulder to shoulder with Roman nobles, their faces alight with anticipation of witnessing history. They saw only the glorious surface, the mighty king, the pious pope, the rebirth of empire. They could not see the black seed of horror that had been planted at its core. The ceremony began. Charlemagne walked down the long nave, a giant of a man moving with a slow, deliberate dignity that hid the leaden weight in his soul. He knelt at the high altar, as prescribed. Leo, facing him, began the liturgy, his voice echoing through the vast space with a strength that belied the terror in his heart. The prayers were said, the hymns were sung. The roar of the crowd in St. Peter's was not a sound of celebration to Charlemagne's ears. It was the roar of a great, mindless beast that had just been fed a potent and dangerous myth. A myth he himself had just become the living, breathing center of. The adulation washing over him in waves felt like a physical pressure, each cry of Carolo Augusto, a link in the chain of the magnificent lie he was now condemned to uphold. The weight of the crown, that cold, brilliant circle of gold, was an agony beyond any physical pain. It was the weight of the entire future pressing down on him, the crushing burden of the knowledge that every triumph he achieved from this day forward was merely raw material for the apocalyptic ruin he had witnessed. He stood there, a colossus draped in purple and silk, his face a masterfully carved mask of gratitude and pious humility, while inside, his soul was a scorched landscape, echoing with the screams of betrayal and the cold, silent laughter of the faceless shadow. He raised a hand, the gesture meant to quiet the throng, and the silence that fell was even more profound than the noise, a hungry void waiting to be filled with his words. He spoke then, his voice, trained to project across battlefields, now filling the vast basilica with a sonorous, statesmanlike grace, thanking God, praising the Pope, speaking of unity, peace, and a new dawn for Christendom. Every word was ash in his mouth. He was constructing the glorious edifice of his public persona brick by brick, each word a brick that also walled him deeper into his own solitary, terrifying secret. He looked out over the sea of faces, the fierce, loyal faces of his Frankish counts, their eyes shining with uncritical devotion, the calculating, politic faces of the Roman nobility, already scheming how to profit from this new order, the serene faces of the clergy, blissfully unaware that their new emperor had just pledged a secret, blasphemous vow that had nothing to do with their gentle Christ. And then his gaze fell upon them, his sons. Young Charles, just a boy, beaming with uncomplicated pride at his magnificent father. Pepin, stronger, already with a warrior's bearing, chest puffed out, and Louis, the most pious, his hands clasped as if in prayer, his eyes wide with reverence. A love so fierce and painful it was akin to a physical wound seized Charlemagne's heart, followed immediately by a wave of nauseating horror so powerful he almost staggered. The face from the vision, which one was it? Was it the boldness in Pepin's eyes that would curdle into ruthless ambition? Was it the piety in Louis's that would twist into fanatical hypocrisy? Was it the youthful adoration in young Charles's that would sour into resentful hatred? The stone's poison was already at work, turning his deepest paternal love into a source of constant, gnawing suspicion. He finished his address to another thunderous ovation. The rest of the ceremony, the Mass, the blessings, the slow procession out of the basilica into the weak winter sunlight of Rome, passed for Charlemagne in a dissociative haze. He was a spectator watching his own body perform the rituals of kingship. The cheers of the masses lining the streets, the petals thrown from windows, the pealing of every church bell in the city, it was all a distant, muffled dream. His entire consciousness was turned inward, a general surveying the internal battlefield where the first and most important war of his reign was already raging. His strategy began to form not from hope, but from a grim, deterministic resolve. If the future was fixed, a monstrous, pre-written play, then he would use every ounce of his will to change the script. He would become the most vigilant, the most powerful, the most untouchable emperor the world had ever seen. He would build an empire so strong, so unified, so impregnably righteous that the rod of betrayal would find no purchase. He would love his sons, but he would also watch them. He would train them, but he would also test them. He would bind them to him with bonds of loyalty and fear so strong that the very notion of betrayal would become unthinkable. He would become such a titan that the shadow behind the throne would find nothing to cling to. This was his new purpose. The coronation was over. The public history was written. But as the imperial procession wound its way through the streets of Rome, the newly crowned Emperor Charles Augustus was already drafting the secret edicts of his hidden war. He would return to Acca not just as a ruler, but as a warden of his own destiny. Every law he passed, every battle he fought, every church he built, would have a dual purpose, one for the empire, and one for his silent, desperate struggle against the prophecy. The palace he would build would be a fortress against the future. His court would be a web of informants, watching not just for external enemies, but for the first, faintest signs of the internal decay he knew was coming. He would create a machine of state so perfect that it could even defy fate. It was a monumental, impossible task, the ultimate act of hubris. But Charlemagne was now a man who had stared into the abyss, and rather than let it consume him, he had decided to fill it with his own will, stone by stone, law by law, battle by battle. The long vigil had begun, and it would be conducted not in prayerful silence, but in a frenzy of creation and control that would reshape a continent, all driven by the secret, terrifying knowledge of what awaited at the end of it all. The glory of his reign would be the brightest light the West had seen since the fall of Rome, but he, and he alone, would know that it was a light he was desperately shining into a darkness that was patiently, inexorably, waiting to swallow it. The journey north from Rome to his heartland around Aachen was not a triumphant procession for Charlemagne. It was a somber, strategic retreat into the heart of his own power. A migration of a wounded king returning to his den to lick his wounds and plot. A defense against an enemy only he could perceive. The jubilant crowds that had thronged the Via Flaminia gradually thinned, replaced by the wary, respectful gazes of Lombard peasants and then the familiar, dour faces of his Frankish subjects. With each mile that carried him further from the suffocating, ancient intrigue of Rome and the terrifying memory of the Lapis Imperii, the mask of the jovial, pious emperor could slowly, infinitesimally, begin to loosen. Yet, it never came off. It had, in fact, become a permanent fixture, fused to his soul by the searing heat of his secret knowledge. The weight of the crown was a constant, grinding pressure, a metaphysical anchor tethering him to the dreadful responsibility he now bore. The cheers of his soldiers, the respectful bows of local nobles who rode out to greet their returning emperor, these were no longer sources of pride or validation. They were metrics, data points in the grand, terrifying equation of his reign. Was this loyalty real? Was it durable? Or was it the fragile veneer that would one day crack to reveal the betrayal festering beneath? His sons, riding alongside him, were now the central objects of a relentless, silent scrutiny that would have broken a lesser man's heart. He watched them constantly, not with a father's loving eye, but with the cold, analytical gaze of a strategist assessing a potential battlefield. He noted young Charles's boisterous, sometimes careless, confidence with the horses. Was this the recklessness that would one day translate into a reckless grab for power? He observed Pepin's quiet, intense conversations with his military tutors. Was he building a personal loyalty among the commanders that could bypass his father? He saw Louis's fervent prayers at every roadside cross. Was this genuine piety, or the first sign of the religious fanaticism that could be twisted into justifying patricide? Every laugh, every frown, every display of skill or failure was fed into the churning machinery of his suspicion, each moment analyzed for its hidden, future meaning. The love he felt for them was now a chronic, exquisite pain, a beautiful song played against the dissonant, screaming backdrop of the prophecy. He was mourning them even as he raised them, grieving for the innocent boys they were now, knowing they were destined to become, in whole or in part, the architects of his nightmare. Upon his return to Aachen, the imperial capital thrummed with a new, electric energy. The coronation had changed everything. The king of the Franks was now emperor, and the entire court buzzed with the prestige and possibility of this new era. But Charlemagne saw it all through his new, fractured lens. The ambitious building projects, the magnificent Palatine Chapel, the sprawling palace complex, the baths inspired by ancient Rome, were not merely expressions of power and culture. To him, they were fortifications. He drove the architects and engineers with a frantic, relentless energy, poring over plans late into the night by the light of flickering oil lamps. Every stone laid was another barrier against the chaos to come. The chapel, with its vast, soaring dome, was not just a place of worship. It was a deliberate, monumental fist shaken at the heavens, a declaration that the light of God and empire would stand firm against the ancient, pagan darkness he had witnessed. The palace itself was designed with a new, almost paranoid attention to security and sight lines, private corridors for his use only, chambers with commanding views of the courtyards, a personal guard drawn not from the high nobility but from loyal, landless fighters whose fortunes were tied solely to his own. He began to institutionalize his vigilance. What had once been a network of trusted missi dominici, envoys sent to govern the provinces, was now subtly transformed into a nascent intelligence apparatus. Their reports, which once focused on law, taxation, and rebellion, now carried a new, secret set of instructions: watch the great families, note any unusual alliances, monitor the movements and conversations of his own grown sons as they began to take on governorships. He was weaving a web of observation across his entire empire, a net designed to catch the first stirrings of the serpent of betrayal he knew was coiled somewhere within his own house. His intellectual pursuits, the famous Carolingian Renaissance, took on this same dual, desperate character. The gathering of scholars from across Europe, Alcuin of York, Paul the Deacon, Peter of Pisa, was not merely a love of learning. It was a weapon. Charlemagne understood that ignorance was the soil in which the darkness thrived. A unified, educated, orthodox empire would be a coherent, strong entity, resistant to the fissures of heresy and dissent that could be exploited by the malevolence he feared. The painstaking copying of ancient texts, the standardization of liturgy, the reforms of handwriting into the clear, beautiful Carolingian minuscule, all of this was a fight against entropy, a desperate attempt to impose order and light onto a world he now knew was haunted by a primordial chaos. He would sit for hours with Alcuin, discussing theology and philosophy, and the wise scholar would see only an emperor's pious curiosity. He did not see the man desperately searching the ancient texts for any mention of things like the lapis imperii, for any precedent of a prophecy overturned, for any weapon that could be used in a war against fate itself. Every Bible verse about free will was clung to as a lifeline. Every classical tale of hubris and downfall was studied as a tactical manual of what to avoid. His court became the brightest center of learning in the world, a beacon of civilization, and its emperor was the driving force behind it all, a man trying to outrun a shadow by generating so much light that the shadow would have nowhere to fall. The wars continued, but their nature changed. The brutal campaigns against the Saxons, the Avars, the Lombards, they were no longer just about conquest and conversion. They were about eliminating distractions. Every external threat pacified was one less variable, one less potential ally for the internal enemy he knew was coming. The famous ruthlessness, the forced baptisms, the draconian laws, they were the actions of a man who believed he was not just building an empire, but building a fortress. He was clearing the field around him, ensuring that when the final, fated conflict came, it would be a clean fight, a confrontation purely between his will and the destiny the stone had decreed. He fought with a new, terrifying ferocity, as if he could kill the future itself on the battlefields of the present. And through it all, the public face remained, the generous emperor, the devoted father, the wise ruler. He hosted magnificent feasts, his laughter booming through the hall, even as his eyes constantly scanned the room, noting who spoke to whom, which of his sons received the most attention from which ambitious courtier. He was performing an epic, lifelong play for an audience of one, the silent, watching future. The strain was inhuman. The weight of the double life, the public emperor and the private, terrified seer, bent his broad shoulders. Sleep became a fleeting visitor, chased away by the green glow of the stone that waited behind his eyelids. The face of the betrayer, once a fleeting image, now became a constant ghost at the feast, a presence in every room. His reign was a golden age, a magnificent crescendo of power, art, and faith. But for the man at its center, it was a prison of his own making, a gilded cage where he was both the emperor and his own most vigilant jailer, watching the horizon for an enemy he had already met, and waiting for a blow he knew was destined to come from the hand he most longed to trust. The decades of Charlemagne's reign unfolded like a magnificent, intricate tapestry woven with threads of gold and blood, of faith and steel. A sprawling masterpiece that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Elbe. A testament to a will that sought to defy the very currents of time and fate. Yet, to the man whose name the age bore, every golden thread was interwoven with a single, black filament of dread, a constant, humming tension that vibrated at the core of his being, a silent scream underlying every state decree, every military victory, every paternal blessing. The magnificent palace at Aachen, with its soaring chapel and bustling scholarly halls, was not a home. It was the command center for his endless, secret war. The courtiers, scholars, and soldiers who filled its rooms saw only the grandeur, the power, the vibrant intellectual and political life. They could not perceive the invisible architecture of paranoia that their emperor had constructed around himself, a labyrinth of suspicion whose walls grew higher and more impenetrable with each passing year. The cheerful, robust figure who presided over feasts, debated theology with Alcuin, and personally examined the plans for new cathedrals and bridges, was a masterpiece of deception, a golem of willpower animated solely by the desperate need to prove the lapis imperii wrong. Every action, every policy, every relationship was filtered through the terrible knowledge he carried. His famous temper, once a sporadic fire, now became a carefully deployed tool, a sudden storm used to keep everyone, allies, family, advisors, perpetually off balance, ensuring no one could ever feel secure enough to form the conspiracy he knew was inevitable. His generosity was equally strategic, binding men to him with chains of gold and land, making the cost of betrayal unimaginably high. He was building a world so saturated with his own influence that rebellion would be not just treason, but a form of existential suicide for the betrayer. His sons, now men grown and given subkingdoms to rule, Charles in Neustria, Pepin in Italy, Louis in Aquitaine, were the central planets in this tense solar system, their orbits carefully calculated and constantly monitored by the gravitational pull of their father's watchful dread. Missi Dominici, his trusted envoys, traveled not only with orders of governance but with secret questionnaires, their eyes and ears tuned to the whispers of the young king's courts. Did Prince Pepin consult too often with Lombard nobles whose fathers had opposed Frankish rule? Did Prince Louis's religious fervor lead him to clerics who preached a doctrine of obedience to God above that to the emperor? Did young Charles's popularity with the Frankish cavalry units suggest a martial ambition that could be turned against the throne? The reports flowed back to Aachen, where Charlemagne would spend long, lonely nights in his private scriptorium, a room that echoed the terrible circularity of the one in Rome, poring over them by candlelight, cross-referencing names, dates, alliances, searching for the first faint pattern that matched the horrifying image burned into his mind. He loved them with a father's heart, but that love was now a battlefield, a site of constant conflict between paternal affection and imperial terror. He would summon them for extended stays at court, not for joyous family reunions, but for prolonged, subtle interrogations disguised as political counsel or hunting trips. He would praise their accomplishments with one breath and, with the next, deliver a crushing, seemingly arbitrary criticism designed to test their loyalty, to see if their resolve would crack, to probe for the weakness that the vision had promised. He was hardening them, he told himself. He was making them strong, loyal, and impervious to the temptations of power. In truth, he was torturing them and himself, creating the very atmosphere of uncertainty and tension that could foster resentment, and perhaps, plant the seeds of the very betrayal he sought to prevent. The intellectual flourishing of his reign, the Carolingian Renaissance, was the brightest front in his war. He understood that the darkness he fought fed on ignorance, on superstition, on fragmented truths. His drive to collect and copy ancient manuscripts, to reform education for the clergy and nobility, to standardize the Vulgate Bible and the liturgy, was a campaign to create a unified, enlightened bulwark against the chaotic, primeval evil represented by the lapis imperii. He wasn't just preserving knowledge, he was manufacturing a vaccine against the past, a serum of reason and faith to inoculate his empire against the older, darker gods and the truths they dealt in. In his private discussions with Alcuin, he would steer conversations toward the nature of prophecy, of free will versus predestination, probing the Church's doctrines for any loophole, any theological weapon that could invalidate the stone's verdict. If God is all-powerful, and man has free will, can a vision of the future ever be absolute? He would ask, his tone casual, scholarly, while his soul hung on the answer. Alcuin, thinking he was engaging in a theoretical debate, would speak of God's omniscience existing outside of time, of prophecies as warnings that allowed for repentance and change. Charlemagne would cling to these words, these nuances, like a drowning man to splinters of wood. They became the justification for his immense effort, the theological bedrock for his rebellion against fate. Every school established, every beautiful book produced in the scriptorium of Aachen, was another blow struck against the formless, ancient shadow. He was building an empire of light, and he dared the darkness to try and extinguish it. Yet the cost of this eternal vigilance was etching itself deeply into him. The robust warrior king began to show the strains of a 40-year secret war. The sleepless nights left permanent bruises under his eyes. The constant, internal pressure of his hidden fears sometimes manifested in a sudden, inexplicable melancholy that would descend upon him in the midst of court festivities, a dark cloud that his courtiers learned to fear and avoid. He would sometimes stand for long minutes on the gallery of his chapel, looking down at the rituals of the faith he was defending, and feel a profound, isolating distance, as if he were watching a play from a very faraway seat. He was the defender of Christendom, but his own faith had been irrevocably complicated, mutated by his encounter with a power that felt older than the Christian God. He prayed not for salvation, but for strength to fight. He took the Eucharist not for grace, but as a soldier taking rations for a long campaign. The man was disappearing, consumed by the role of Emperor Vigilant, his personal self sacrificed on the altar of his impossible task. The glory of his reign was the shimmering surface of an ocean whose depths were black, cold, and filled with a monstrous, patient pressure. He had built the most powerful empire in the known world, a beacon of civilization in a dark age, and he ruled it from a throne that felt, every single day, like the edge of a precipice. He waited, he watched, and he wielded his immense power with a focus and intensity that history would attribute to genius, but which was, in truth, the frantic, heroic, and tragic effort of a man trying to use the instruments of temporal power to fight a war against an enemy that existed in the future, an enemy he had seen in a flash of green light on a black stone, an enemy that wore the face of his own son. The relentless march of years, which softened the sharp edges of memory for ordinary men, only honed the terrifying clarity of Charlemagne's vision to a razor's edge. Time was not a healer. It was the ever-tightening noose of the prophecy, each passing season bringing him irrevocably closer to the moment of fruition he both dreaded and, in a dark, secret corner of his soul, perversely longed for, if only to end the unbearable suspense. The magnificent edifice of his empire, the Carolingian Renaissance, the unified Christendom, all of it was now a vast, complex machine whirring with a single, desperate purpose, to create a reality so robust, so luminous, so logically and theologically sound that it could not possibly contain the chaotic, bloody betrayal he had witnessed. He became a master architect of destiny, attempting to outbuild fate itself. Every law in the Admonitio Generalis and the Capitularies was not just a statute for governance. It was a thread in a net designed to catch the future. Laws standardizing weights and measures were meant to eliminate economic grievance, a potential seed of discontent. Decrees on the proper administration of justice were intended to create a universal sense of fairness, robbing potential rebels of popular support. His relentless military campaigns to secure the borders were not merely for expansion or defense. They were a brutal form of housekeeping, clearing away all external chaos so that if and when the internal rot revealed itself, it would be isolated, contained, and utterly alone against the focused might of his perfected state. This immense effort cast a long, distorting shadow over his relationships, turning the natural dynamics of a royal court into a paranoid's theater of potential treachery. His closest advisors, the pillars of his reign, the wise Alcuin, the loyal Einhard, the fierce Roland, were unaware that they were players in a drama whose true script only the emperor knew. Their counsel was received not on its own merits, but filtered through the single, burning question: did this advice, however well-intentioned, inadvertently create a condition that could lead to the fulfillment of the prophecy? A suggestion to grant a noble more land was scrutinized for potentially creating a rival power base. A recommendation to show mercy to a defeated foe was weighed against the risk of fostering a vengeful enemy who could one day ally with his sons. His court became a garden where he was both the gardener and a constant, frantic seeker of weeds, yet terrified that the very act of digging to find them might be planting new ones. The joviality of his feasts was a carefully orchestrated performance, a display of confidence designed to project an image of unshakable security, while his eyes, sharp and missed nothing, scanned the hall, noting a whispered conversation between two counts from different regions, a lingering glance between a courtier and one of his son's attendants, a joke that landed a little too well with the military commanders. Each a data point, a variable in the unsolvable equation of his fear. But the true heart of his silent war, the front that consumed 99 parts of his vigilance, remained his sons. The boys were now men in the prime of their lives, and with each year, the ghostly face from the vision superimposed itself upon their real features with more terrifying plausibility. The happy, boisterous young Charles had grown into a formidable warrior, his strength and courage a mirror of his father's youth. Yet, every time Charlemagne saw him practicing at the Quintin, his swordplay fierce and flawless, he did not see a son to be proud of. He saw the military prowess that could be turned against him. He heard the admiring cheers of the troops not as a claim for his lineage, but as the mustering of a future rebel army. He began, subtly at first, then more overtly, to marginalize him, assigning him to secondary campaigns, surrounding him with advisors loyal solely to the emperor, quietly dismantling his personal network of influence. He was, with a father's loving, terrified hands, systematically crushing the spirit of his firstborn, creating the very sense of slight and frustration that could curdle into the hatred he feared. Pepin ruling Italy was a different kind of worry. His intelligence and administrative skill were undeniable, but he possessed a quiet, calculating nature that Charlemagne's poisoned imagination interpreted as secretiveness, ambition. His correspondence with his father was full of efficient reports and dutiful requests, but the emperor would spend hours parsing every phrase, looking for hidden meanings, for coded messages, for the faintest trace of the betrayal he knew was coming. He would send unexpected auditors to Pepin's treasury, not to check for embezzlement, but to see if funds were being secretly diverted to hire mercenaries. He promoted men in Pepin's court known for their absolute loyalty to the crown, creating a layer of surveillance around his own son. He was treating a competent governor like a potential insurrectionist, and with every distrustful act, he pushed Pepin further away, forcing him into a self-reliance that looked, to the emperor's paranoid eye, exactly like preparation for rebellion. And Louis, the pious, the devout. His intense religiosity, which should have been a comfort, became the most frightening possibility of all. History was full of zealots who committed terrible acts in the name of God. What if Louis's betrayal was not one of ambition, but of fanaticism? What if some heretical priest, some twisted interpretation of scripture, convinced him that removing his father was God's will? Charlemagne inundated Louis's court in Aquitaine with orthodox theologians, spies in clerical robes tasked with monitoring the religious climate and reporting any hint of extremist thought. He demanded Louis attend him at Aachen for months at a time, ostensibly for spiritual guidance, but in reality to keep him under his own watchful eye, to subject his faith to constant testing and questioning. He was not nurturing a son's soul, he was interrogating a potential heretic. The tragic, self-fulfilling nature of his prophecy was now in full, horrifying motion. The lapis imperii had not shown him an inevitable future, it had given him a recipe. By showing him the end result of betrayal, it had compelled him to act in ways that made betrayal not only possible, but increasingly likely. His obsessive vigilance was the fertilizer for the seeds of discord. His distrust was the water that made them grow. His attempts to control every aspect of their lives were the oppressive heat that would force the plant of resentment to burst forth. He loved them, he feared for them, he was proud of them, and he was systematically destroying his relationship with each of them, all in a desperate, heroic, and utterly tragic attempt to save them from a fate that only he knew was waiting. The weight of the crown was now the weight of this terrible paradox. He was the architect of his own nightmare, building the path to his downfall with every loving, fearful, distrustful act he took to prevent it. The empire was at its zenith, its power and glory echoing through the world, and its emperor, the great Charlemagne, was alone in his gilded cage, watching the three sons he adored, waiting for one of them to become the monster he had already met in a vision 30 years before, and knowing, in his heart, that his own actions were writing the script for the tragedy to come. The zenith of an empire, that glorious, precarious peak from which the only possible direction is down, became for Charlemagne not a point of triumph, but the observation post for a commander surveying a battlefield where the enemy was time itself. The splendid isolation of his power was absolute, a citadel of one, and within its impregnable walls, the emperor waged a war so subtle, so vast, and so psychologically torturous that it would have shattered a mind less formidable. The external trappings of his rule, the flowing silks, the weighty crown, the reverence of thousands, were now merely the instruments of his internal siege, tools to be wielded in a desperate holding action against the entropy foretold by the lapis imperii. His famed energy, which had once charged across continents, was now funneled inward, into a monumental effort of control that sought to regulate not just the actions of men, but the very flow of history. The palace at Aachen, with its echoing halls and bustling scriptoria, was the physical manifestation of this effort, a machine designed to generate order, and at its heart was the Emperor, the chief engineer, whose blueprints were stained with the psychic residue of a decades-old nightmare. This war manifested in 1,000 daily rituals of paranoia, each more elaborate than the last. His table, once a place of boisterous feasting and open council, became a stage for a subtle and relentless intelligence operation. The seating arrangements at every meal were personally dictated by Charlemagne, not based on protocol or favor, but on a complex and shifting map of alliances and potential threats he maintained in his mind. Rivals were placed together to gauge their interaction. Loyalists were positioned to overhear specific conversations. His sons were always seated within his direct line of sight. Their every expression, every murmured word to a neighbor, every reaction to a piece of news, meticulously catalogued and later analyzed in the solitude of his chambers. The food itself was tasted not once, but multiple times by different, trusted servants on a rotating schedule he designed himself, a system meant to thwart not only poison but the potential for any single taster to be suborned. Gift-giving, a central practice of diplomacy and patronage, transformed into a labyrinthine exercise in risk assessment. Every offering from a noble, a fine Spanish stallion, a jeweled gospel, a Saxon sword, was subjected to days of scrutiny. Was the horse too perfect, a potential vehicle for a future assassin's swift approach? Was the jeweled binding of the gospel loose, a hiding place for a venom? Was the sword, however beautiful, a symbolic threat? His acceptance or rejection of gifts sent ripples of confusion and anxiety through the court, for they were based on a logic no one else could comprehend, the secret calculus of a man defending against a threat from the future. His engagement with the Carolingian Renaissance deepened into an obsession for creating a single, unified, and immutable truth. The scriptorium at Aachen was not just a place of learning, it was an armory where weapons against chaos were forged. He didn't just order the copying of texts, he demanded the creation of a definitive corpus. Every manuscript was collated against others, discrepancies were noted, and a single, authorized version was established by a council of scholars under his direct supervision. This was not mere scholarly rigor, it was an attempt to eliminate hermeneutic wiggle room, to create a world where scripture, law, and history had only one interpretation, his interpretation. He feared a fragmented truth the way other kings feared a fragmented army, for he believed heresy and conflicting narratives were the cracks through which the shadow of betrayal would seep. He sponsored the arts not for beauty's sake, but for propaganda's sake. The mosaics in the Palatine Chapel depicting his reign as a continuation of David's and Constantine's were a visual argument against dissolution. The epic poems composed by his court poets were not entertainments but myth-making tools, designed to weave his lineage and authority so tightly into the fabric of history that unraveling it would seem like an act against nature itself. He was trying to create a world so coherent, so solid, and so documented that the chaotic, bloody future he had seen would have no logical place to exist within it. But the most devastating theater of his war remained his family. His daughters, whom he kept unwed at court, became his most trusted eyes and ears, not because they spied for him willingly, but because their presence created a web of familial intimacy that he could monitor. Their suitors were vetted with an intensity that bordered on madness, their bloodlines traced for any hint of connection to the old, pagan nobility of Rome or the treacherous Lombard families. He saw potential conspirators in every duke and count who glanced at his girls. His sister, Gisela, the abbess of Chelles, became one of his few confidants, a recipient of coded letters filled with elliptical references to the old illness, or the persistent shadow, their correspondence a lonely attempt to share a burden that could not be named. And his sons, the three kings. His strategy towards them evolved from watchful suspicion to active, preemptive manipulation. He began to practice a brutal form of realpolitik within his own household, a strategy of divide and rule. He would publicly praise one son to the others, fostering jealousy. He would grant a coveted privilege to Charles, perhaps the right to lead the annual Mayfield parade, only to quietly grant Pepin a more strategically significant border garrison, and then bestow a valuable monastery's income upon Louis, ensuring no one son felt secure in his favor or powerful enough to challenge the whole. He played them against each other, believing that if they were competitors, they could never be co-conspirators. He was deliberately fracturing his own legacy to save it, creating the very internecine strife that would tear the empire apart after his death. all to avoid the single, catastrophic betrayal of his own person that the stone had promised. The love he felt for them during their rare, unguarded moments, seeing Louis lost in prayer with genuine fervor, watching Pepin successfully mediate a complex dispute among his Italian nobles, hearing of Charles's personal bravery in a skirmish on the Breton March, would hit him with the force of a physical blow, a wave of agonizing tenderness followed by the crushing return of his dread. He was mourning them in real time, grieving the fathers they would never have, the trust they would never know, the unconditional love he was psychologically incapable of giving them anymore. He was their father, their emperor, and their future antagonist, all at once. The psychological toll was immense. The man who had once been known for his robust health and thunderous laughter began to suffer from bouts of profound melancholy. He would retreat for days into his private quarters, refusing all but the most essential visitors, staring at maps not of his empire, but of his own lineage, tracing the bloodlines as if searching for the flaw, the cursed gene that would carry out the prophecy. He developed a recurring pain in his right hand, the one that had touched the lapis imperii, a cold, arthritic ache that flared up in times of stress, a permanent phantom reminder of that frozen, damnable contact. The crown of the Holy Roman Empire, the greatest temporal power in the West, was the crown of thorns he wore every waking moment. He ruled over a golden age, a beacon of civilization, and he experienced it as a long, slow, exquisite crucifixion, nailed to the cross of his own terrible knowledge, watching the horizon for the enemy he had created in his own image, in the faces of his sons, waiting for the blow he had spent a lifetime preparing for, and in preparing for, had made inevitable. The prophecy was no longer a thing of the future. It was the engine of the present, and he was both its prisoner and its frantic, helpless engineer. The final decade of Charlemagne's reign was a magnificent, gilded decay, a slow and stately procession towards a precipice that only he could see. The empire, to all outward appearances, had achieved a plateau of power and cultural efflorescence that seemed as if it could last 1,000 years. The machinery of state, honed by his relentless will, hummed with a smooth, bureaucratic efficiency. The frontiers, secured by decades of ruthless campaigning, were quieter than they had been in living memory. The scholarly output from Aachen and its satellite monastic schools was a torrent of beautifully illuminated manuscripts, legal codes, and theological commentaries, creating a cohesive intellectual framework for a unified Christendom. Yet, this golden autumn was, for the emperor, the most terrifying season of all. The very stability he had fought so hard to create felt like the eerie calm before the storm he knew was brewing. His war was no longer one of expansion or consolidation. It was a war of preservation against an enemy he could not locate, a war against the ticking clock of his own mortality, and against the sinister maturation of the destiny he had witnessed in the green fire of the lapis imperii. His actions became more extreme, his policies more rigid, his isolation more complete, as the shadow of the prophecy finally began to stretch across the present, its dark fingers touching the world in ways that confirmed his deepest fears and challenged his sanity. He became a connoisseur of portents, seeing the future's grim signature in every minor misfortune. An unseasonal frost that blighted the vineyards in Aquitaine was not a weather pattern. It was a sign of the coldness that would enter the heart of King Louis. A fire that broke out in the granaries of Trier was not an accident. It was a foreshadowing of the conflagration of war that would consume the realm. When a beloved falcon, a symbol of imperial nobility, was found dead in its mews, its neck broken from a mysterious fall, Charlemagne retreated to his chambers for 3 days, convinced it was a direct metaphor for the breaking of his own line. His courtiers whispered of the emperor's growing superstition, attributing it to age. They did not know he was living in a world where the veil between the present and the future was irreparably thin, where every event was a potential symbol and a horrifying narrative only he could read. He ordered his scholars to scour ancient texts, not just Christian, but Roman, Greek, even fragments of Egyptian and Babylonian lore that found their way to his court, for any mention of oracles that had been thwarted, for any precedent of a man escaping his fate. This was no longer scholarly curiosity. It was the desperation of a man seeking a lifeline in the accumulated wisdom of all ages, a prisoner searching every book ever written for the key to his cell. His relationship with the church deepened into a complex, symbiotic bond fraught with hidden tension. He saw the church, with its universal hierarchy and claim to eternal truths, as the ultimate bulwark against the chaos prophesied by the pagan stone. He poured vast wealth into bishoprics and monasteries, not just as acts of piety, but to create a network of loyal, powerful institutions that would owe their existence to him and would, in theory, remain loyal to his vision and his bloodline against any future usurper. His theological inquiries with Alcuin and others took on a new, urgent specificity. He pushed them on the concepts of angelic guardianship, on the possibility of divine intervention to alter set courses, on the nature of sacred oaths and whether a vow extracted under the duress of a diabolical vision could be considered binding. He was, in effect, attempting to use the full might of Christian theology to exorcise the demon of his future. He commissioned a new, monumental altar for the Palatine Chapel, its front panel depicting not Christ or the saints, but the four evangelists standing guard over the symbols of the empire: the crown, the sword, the orb, and the scepter. It was a silent prayer in gold and gemstones, a plea for divine protection not for his soul, but for his legacy, a magical ward against the betrayal to come. But the most profound and tragic evolution was in his handling of the succession. The prophecy had morphed from a vague dread into a specific, terrifying certainty: the betrayal would come from one of his 3 sons. His policy of divide and rule, meant to keep them weak, had instead created 3 powerful, resentful, and mutually suspicious rival courts. The news that filtered back to Aachen was increasingly alarming. King Charles of Neustria, the warrior, was surrounding himself with young, ambitious Frankish nobles who spoke openly of the old ways, and expressed frustration with the emperor's cautious, administrative style. King Pepin of Italy was proving to be a shrewd and popular ruler, forging strong alliances with the Lombard nobility his father had subdued, and his reports home became models of efficient obfuscation, revealing nothing of his true mind. King Louis of Aquitaine, the pious, was falling under the influence of a severe, reformist bishop who preached the supremacy of the Church over the temporal power, even the power of an emperor. To Charlemagne, these were not the independent developments of his sons maturing into their roles. They were the first active movements of the prophecy, the pieces on the board shifting into the positions he had seen in his vision decades before. The shadow was no longer behind the throne. It was taking root in the very kingdoms he had given his sons. His response was a final, frantic series of moves that sealed the empire's fate. He summoned his sons to Aachen not for a family gathering, but for a series of individual, intensely confrontational audiences. He accused Charles of warmongering and ambition, stripping him of 2 key counties and giving them to a loyal, older retainer. He confronted Pepin with a list of disloyal Lombard advisors and demanded they be exiled, humiliating him in front of his own retinue. With Louis, he engaged in a fierce theological argument about the limits of papal authority, publicly condemning the views of his son's favorite bishop and effectively placing Louis's religious life under imperial surveillance. These actions were not the rational calculations of a statesman planning a smooth succession. They were the terrified lashings out of a man who saw the ghost of betrayal in every corner and was trying to beat it back with a sword. He was actively creating the grievances that would justify rebellion. He was giving his sons concrete reasons to fear and resent him, providing the very fuel for the fire he was trying to prevent. The weight of this self-destructive crusade broke his health. The pains in his hands spread throughout his body. His legendary stamina faded, and he began to suffer from fevers that the physicians could not explain. In his few lucid moments between illness and the crushing fatigue of his eternal vigilance, he would have his scribes read to him from the book of Job, finding a perverse comfort in the story of a righteous man tested by a God whose plans were inscrutable and whose methods were harsh. He had started his reign believing he was a new David. He was ending it feeling like Job, a man besieged by a divine, or demonic, antagonism he could not understand. The magnificent court at Aachen, the center of the world, became a sick room and a command center for a war that was being lost inside the emperor's own body and mind. The gold seemed to tarnish, the music to sound hollow, the scholarly debates to become meaningless whispers against the roaring certainty of the coming end. He had built a world of light, but he was dying in the darkness of his own making, watching the 3 stars of his sons, Charles, Pepin, and Louis, burn with a cold, distant light, waiting for one of them to become the comet that would strike the earth and shatter everything he had built. The prophecy was no longer approaching, it had arrived. It was in the air he breathed, in the pain in his bones, in the suspicious eyes of his sons, and in the cold, silent weight of the crown that now felt less like a circle of gold and more like the iron band of a tomb. The final winter that settled over Aachen was not merely a season. It was a physical manifestation of the internal glacial epoch that had claimed Charlemagne's soul. The world saw an aging emperor, his great frame stooped and thinned by time, his famed vitality succumbing to the inevitable decay of flesh. They witnessed his retreat from the public eye, his longer absences from the grand hall, and attributed it to the natural infirmities of a man who had lived a life of unparalleled exertion. They could not perceive that the true battle was not against the failing of his body, but against the terrifying convergence of his prophecy with reality, a convergence that transformed the magnificent Palatine Chapel from a symbol of divine favor into a cage of echoing dread and the entire imperial capital into a sprawling chessboard where every move was predetermined by a game played decades in the past. His sickness was a duality, the physical fevers and rheumatic pains that plagued him, and the metaphysical fever of his vigilance, which now burned with a frantic, dying intensity. His private chambers, once a sanctuary, became a nerve center for a war he was visibly losing. Maps of the empire were no longer annotated with military campaigns or economic reforms, but with cryptic, trembling notes about the movements of his son's agents, the allegiances of border counts, and the travel routes of bishops whose orthodoxy he now questioned. The lapis imperii had ceased to be a memory. It was a living entity in the room with him, its cold presence a constant companion, its silent, green-glowing verdict the only truth in a world of lies. He began to communicate in a coded language, even with his most trusted aides. A request for news from Italy was not a query about governance, but a demand for an update on Pepin's loyalty. A comment on the harshness of the winter in Aquitaine was a veiled accusation about the coldness he perceived in Louis's heart. His court, accustomed to his direct and powerful commands, now floundered in a sea of implication and fear, each man terrified of misinterpreting the emperor's increasingly Delphic utterances and incurring the wrath that now flashed in his eyes with unpredictable ferocity. This opacity became its own kind of tyranny, breeding a paralysis that seeped from the palace out into the machinery of government, as officials, afraid to act without explicit, and now unforthcoming, imperial direction, let matters of state languish. The sons, the three kings who were the living, breathing vessels of his terror, became spectral presences in Aachen even when they were miles away in their own domains. Their letters, read to him by scribes, were subjected to a hermeneutics of paranoia. He would have a single phrase read aloud over and over, searching for a hidden meaning, a coded message, a trace of the contempt he knew was coming. Your loyal son, Pepin. Was the loyalty emphasized a bit too much? Was it a protestation that hinted at its opposite? I pray for your health daily, father. From Louis, was it a genuine prayer, or an impatient waiting for the inheritance? A gift of fine armor from Charles, was it a tribute from a warrior son, or a symbolic promise of conflict? He began to dictate replies that were themselves masterpieces of passive aggression and psychological manipulation, designed to test their resolve, to probe for weakness, to force the hidden betrayal into the open before he was too weak to confront it. He was like a man poking a sleeping beast with a stick, desperate to see it stir so he could fight it, yet terrified of its awakening. The love he felt for them was now a ghost limb, a sensation he could remember but no longer feel, amputated by the surgeon's knife of his fear. He was preparing for their betrayal not as a father, but as a general prepares for a siege, stockpiling resentment and suspicion behind his own walls. This internal corrosion began to generate its own external signs, strange and unsettling occurrences that the court could not explain, but which Charlemagne saw as the first cracks in the dam of reality, the future beginning to leak into the present. A respected, elderly monk in the Aachen scriptorium, a man who had dedicated his life to illuminating gospels, was found one morning having meticulously defaced every image of an emperor or king in every manuscript he was working on, scratching out the eyes with a fine knife. When questioned, he could only babble about blind crowns and sightless scepters. The court dismissed it as senility. Charlemagne saw it as a direct commentary on his own situation, a man who had been shown a terrible sight and was now blind to all else. A prized white stallion from his own stables, an animal known for its perfect temperament, suddenly and for no reason reared and crushed a stable boy to death against the walls of its stall. It was seen as a tragic accident. The emperor saw it as an omen of trusted things turning murderous. Most chillingly, a young, talented bard from Lombardy, a favorite of Pepin's court who had been sent to Aachen to perform new lays of imperial glory, was found dead in his quarters. There were no marks of violence, no sign of struggle or poison. He had simply stopped living. The physicians spoke of a sudden failure of the heart. Charlemagne, upon hearing the news, fell into a silence that lasted for 2 days. He was convinced the bard had been an agent, a messenger from Pepin carrying some secret word or weapon, and that he had been silenced by a rival agent of one of his other sons in a shadow war that was already beginning in the corridors of his own palace. He ordered a secret investigation, not into the death itself, but into the man's lineage, his connections, his every conversation since arriving in Aachen, seeking the pattern that would reveal which son had made the first move. His physical decline accelerated under the weight of this relentless, solitary warfare. The fevers came more frequently, leaving him weak and disoriented. In these moments of delirium, the barriers between past, present, and future dissolved completely. He would speak to long-dead advisors as if they were in the room, asking them about the stone. He would cry out warnings to Roland, who had fallen at Roncesvalles years before, as if the ambush were happening anew outside his window. He would sometimes clutch the arm of his physician and, with terrifying clarity, describe the exact layout of a room in a palace that did not yet exist, the color of the tapestries, the shape of a throne, and the figure of a young king sitting upon it, a king with a familiar face, now hardened by power and guilt. These prophecies, spoken in a feverish whisper, were diligently recorded by a terrified scribe hidden behind a screen, adding another layer of apocalyptic dread to the already suffocating atmosphere of the court. The great emperor, the father of Europe, was now a prophet of his own doom, his body and mind becoming the very instrument of the oracle he had sought to destroy. The final, cruel irony of the lapis imperii was revealed. It did not need to exist to exert its power. It had transplanted itself into him. He had become the living stone, his dying body the medium through which the cursed future now spoke its terrible truths. The vigil was ending, not in a moment of clarity, but in a cacophony of madness and vision, as the man who had tried to build a wall against fate was finally overwhelmed by the very tide he had spent his life fearing. The shadow was no longer behind the throne. It was in the bedchamber. It was in the fever dream. It was in the emperor's own failing heart, and it was waiting for him to close his eyes so it could step fully into the world. The final descent of Charlemagne was not a gentle fading but a violent, protracted siege, a battle between a titanic will and a destiny that had already woven itself into the fabric of his being. The imperial bedchamber in Aachen, once a place of rest and private council, was transformed into the final command post of his endless war, a space thick with the mingled scents of medicinal herbs, beeswax candles, and the unmistakable, metallic odor of impending death. Yet, the physical death of the body was a secondary concern to the emperor. His entire conscious effort was focused on the metaphysical battle to contain the prophecy, to die without surrendering, to take the secret of the lapis imperii and its horrific vision to his grave unfulfilled, thus breaking its power through the ultimate act of will, his own expiration. He was like a great general making a last stand, using his failing breath as his final army, marshalling every shred of his ebbing consciousness to fortify the walls of the present against the future's invasion. The room was never dark. A dozen lamps and candles burned at all hours, their light a pathetic but stubborn defiance against the shadow he felt pressing in from the corners, a shadow that now had a temperature, a palpable cold that seemed to emanate from a specific point in the room where no candle flame could hold sway. His physicians and attendants moved through this chiaroscuro landscape like ghosts, their faces masks of professional concern and superstitious dread, for the emperor's illness was like no other they had witnessed. He would lapse into fits of trembling, not from fever, but from a cold so profound it seemed to come from within his very marrow, and he would gasp not for air, but as if struggling against an invisible pressure crushing his chest, the weight of the crown now become the weight of the world's fate. His sons were summoned, not for a blessing, but for a final, unconscious interrogation. They stood at the foot of his great bed, 3 powerful kings, the heirs to an empire, reduced to uneasy boys by the terrifying spectacle of their father's dissolution. To Charlemagne's fever-glazed eyes, they were no longer his children. They were archetypes, vessels of possibility, and his ravaged mind subjected them to a scrutiny more intense than any they had ever endured. He would fix his sunken, yet still terrifyingly sharp, eyes on Charles, and see not his firstborn, but the warrior king from his vision, the figure on the broken battlefield, and he would mutter commands about troop dispositions on frontiers that had been pacified years ago, his voice a dry rasp, trying to order the phantom armies of his nightmare. He would turn to Pepin, and in the quiet intelligence of his son's face, he would see the calculating conspirator, the master of shadows, and he would accuse him in slurred, fragmented Latin of treaties made with the Silent Ones and the men of the Old Stone, words that made no sense to the listening court but which spoke of the pagan past and the ancient evil he believed was manipulating events. Then his gaze would fall upon Louis, the pious, and a different kind of terror would seize him. In Louis's devout, concerned expression, Charlemagne saw the fanatic, the zealot who would break the world to save it, and he would plead with him, his voice cracking with a desperate, paternal agony that was horrifying to witness, begging him to hold fast to the church of your father, not the church of the void. A phrase that sent a chill through the clergy present. He was not bestowing a legacy. He was diagnosing 3 separate diseases of the soul that he believed would infect his empire, and in his delirium, he was prescribing antidotes they could not understand. The sons left these audiences not with sorrow, but with a deep, unspoken unease, their father's cryptic accusations and desperate warnings planting seeds of mutual suspicion that would flourish long after he was gone. The prophecy, through the vessel of his dying mind, was successfully transferring itself, inoculating the next generation with the virus of distrust. The world outside the sickroom began to reflect the chaos within. The unprecedented happened. A contingent of Saxon hostages, held for years in Aachen and thought to be fully pacified and Christianized, attempted a mass escape on the night of a new moon. They were swiftly caught and executed, but the event sent a shockwave through the court. Saxony had been quiet for years. This was not a random act of rebellion. To Charlemagne, it was a signal. It was the first move. The shadow was testing the locks on the doors. He demanded his maps, and with a trembling, skeletal finger, he traced the road from Saxony to the residences of each of his sons, muttering about supply lines and speeds of march. He ordered the garrison commanders in Aachen to double the watch, not against external enemies, but to monitor the retainers of the 3 kings who were now in the city. The Imperial Guard, loyal to the point of fanaticism, began to view everyone, even the highest nobles, with suspicion. The court of the great unifier became a nest of whispers and fearful glances, a prelude to the civil wars that would indeed come. The emperor's paranoia had become a self-fulfilling prophecy, generating the very atmosphere of tension and intrigue that made betrayal not just possible, but likely. In his few moments of lucidity, these were the times he feared most, for the clarity was a cruel gift. It allowed him to see the magnificent ruin of his own life's work. He saw how his obsessive vigilance had strained his bonds with his sons. He saw how his fear of the future had poisoned the present. He saw the splendid court he had built now shrouded in an anxiety of his own making. The love for his boys would return in these moments with a force that was physically painful, a pure, unadulterated agony of regret and loss, and he would weep, great, silent tears cutting paths through the parchment-dry skin of his cheeks. He would try to call them back, to offer some word of blessing, some shred of unconditional love, but the moment would inevitably pass, and the cold would return, and the watchful, strategic emperor would reassert himself, the love buried once more beneath the terrible weight of the knowledge he could not escape. The final, true tragedy was dawning on him. The Lapis Imperii had not shown him an inevitable future, it had given him a choice. It had shown him the worst possible outcome, and in his terror of that outcome, he had chosen the path that led directly to it. He had been the author of his own doom all along. This realization was the final, most crushing weight, and it broke not his body, but his spirit. The defiance left him. The war was over. He had lost. The shadow had won not by conquest, but by persuasion, by tricking him into becoming its instrument. On the last day, he did not speak. He simply lay, his eyes open, fixed on that one cold, dark corner of the room where the shadow was thickest. He was no longer fighting it. He was waiting for it. The great Emperor Charles, who had forged an empire with his will, ended his life in silent surrender to the future he had spent decades trying to prevent, his final breath not a sigh of peace, but a silent admission of defeat to the darkness that had always been waiting in the corner of a room in Rome, on a stone that decided, in a night that never ended. The death of the emperor did not bring release. It was not an end but a terrifying translocation, a seismic shift in the nature of the prophecy's existence. The moment Charlemagne's breath stilled in his chest, the immense, 72-year weight of his will, which had acted as a dam holding back the full, catastrophic force of the future he foresaw, vanished. The shadow that had been confined to the corners of his bedchamber, that had been a cold pressure in his heart and a specter in his fever dreams, was suddenly unleashed. It did not dissipate, it expanded. It flowed out from the deathbed like an invisible tide, a psychic shockwave that permeated the very stones of the palace at Aachen, seeped into the foundations of the empire, and poured into the minds and hearts of those who now had to shape the world without him. The meticulously constructed order of his reign, the golden cage of his making, shattered not with a sound, but with a silent, metaphysical detonation that left everything outwardly intact but fundamentally, irrevocably altered. The Lapis Imperii had not merely predicted a future, it had implanted a psychic parasite in the emperor, and his death was the moment of its terrifying maturation and dissemination. The vigil was over. The invasion had begun. The immediate aftermath was a masterpiece of subdued chaos. The court physicians, their faces grim and relieved simultaneously, pronounced the emperor's passing. The senior clergy began the murmured prayers for the dead. The captains of the guard, their hands on their sword pommels, exchanged looks that spoke of a world turned upside down. But the true, hidden drama unfolded in the souls of the three sons. Standing around the still warm body of their father, they were not united in grief. Instead, they were each struck by a unique and paralyzing fragment of their father's haunted consciousness. For Charles the Younger, the eldest and the warrior, a cold, calculating clarity descended upon him. He looked at his brothers not as family, but as rivals. The vague resentments and perceived slights of a lifetime, nurtured by their father's divisive tactics, now crystallized into a single, ruthless thought: the empire is whole. It should remain whole. I am the firstborn. It is mine. He saw not a shared inheritance, but a singular prize to be won, and in that moment, the phantom of the future betrayer gained a will and a purpose. For Pepin of Italy, the intellectual, the feeling was one of profound, unsettling suspicion. The strange, accusatory words of his dying father echoed in his mind. He looked at Charles's martial bearing and saw not a brother, but a blunt instrument of tyranny. He looked at Louis's piety and saw not faith, but a potential theocratic fanaticism. In his mind, a conspiracy theory bloomed, fully formed. His father had been trying to warn him specifically about the ambitions of the others. His duty, as he now felt it, was not to claim the empire, but to protect his own Italian kingdom from the chaos his brothers would inevitably unleash. The isolationist was born from the seed of paranoia. For Louis the Pious, the most sensitive of the three, the experience was one of overwhelming, apocalyptic dread. The air in the room felt thick with impending judgment. His father's pleas about the Church of the Void rang in his ears. He did not see a political succession, he saw a spiritual crisis. The empire was not a possession to be divided, but a sacred trust to be preserved from sin and corruption, a bastion against the coming darkness that only he, now, seemed to understand. The weight of this responsibility felt like a physical force, bending him double with anxiety that was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. He was the chosen one, not for power, but for penance and purification. The zealot received his calling. This psychic fragmentation, this inheritance of their father's splintered fear, dictated their actions in the critical hours and days that followed. There was no moment of shared sorrow, no collective planning for the funeral or the succession. Instead, a tense, unspoken truce descended, a cold war of whispered conferences and hurriedly dispatched messengers. Each brother retreated to his own quarters within the vast palace complex, surrounded by his own loyal retainers. The unified court of Charlemagne instantly balkanized into 3 armed camps under one roof. Charles's men began quietly inventorying the palace guard, sounding out allegiances. Pepin's advisors sent swift riders south toward the Alpine passes, carrying coded messages to his regents in Lombardy. Louis's clerical confidants began poring over biblical and patristic texts, searching for precedents on godly succession and the dangers of fraternal conflict. The empire, which had existed as a single, terrifyingly focused extension of one man's will, now existed as 3 separate, mutually suspicious entities, and the space between them crackled with the unspent energy of their father's decades-long dread. The funeral itself was a surreal pageant of hidden tensions. The great emperor was laid to rest in the precise center of the Palatine Chapel, under the dome that had been his defiance against the heavens. The Requiem Mass was sung with magnificent solemnity, the choir's harmony soaring into the vast space, but the 3 kings who stood as the chief mourners did not hear a unified hymn of mourning. Charles heard a dirge for unity, a warning that the empire's strength would be buried with his father if he did not act to seize it. Pepin heard a lament for broken trust, a soundtrack to the end of an era of stability that his brothers would shatter. Louis heard a call to repentance, a divine indictment of worldly power that demanded a purer, more ascetic leadership. They took the Eucharist from the same bishop, but it was as if they partook of 3 different sacraments, each sanctifying their own fractured path forward. The moment the final Amen echoed away, the fragile truce evaporated. There was no discussion, no council. With a formality that was icier than any outburst of anger, Charles announced his intention to assume their father's authority, and summoned his brothers to a meeting of the Imperial Council, a council he clearly intended to lead. Pepin, with a thin, dismissive smile, declared that matters in Lombardy required his immediate attention and began making preparations to depart within the hour. Louis, his eyes wide with something that looked like religious terror, announced he must retreat to a monastery for a week of prayer and fasting to discern God's will before any temporal decisions could be made. The 3 pillars of the succession had immediately chosen 3 different rooms in which to stand, and the floor was already beginning to crack between them. The shadow of the Lapis Imperii had found its new home. It was no longer confined to one man. It had successfully replicated itself, finding in the 3 sons the perfect vessels for its divisive, destructive power. The war for the future was no longer a secret vigil kept by a solitary emperor. It was now a bloody, open conflict waiting to be declared, and its first battle would not be fought with swords on a field, but with whispers in the corridors of Aachen, with the scratching of pens on parchment, and with the silent hardening of 3 hearts that had once, long ago, beat as one in the presence of their father. The prophecy was alive. It had been born from the stone, nurtured in the emperor's soul, and now it had been set free upon the world. The weeks following the interment of the emperor were a period of eerie, suspended animation, a phony war conducted in the hushed, marble-lined corridors and sun-drenched courtyards of Aachen, where the very air seemed charged with a brittle, waiting tension. The immense gravitational pull of Charlemagne's presence had vanished, and the political universe he had held in meticulous, forced alignment now began to fly apart in slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly calculated motions. The 3 kings did not openly draw swords. Instead, they drew boundaries of influence, etching invisible lines of control through the palace and the empire with the precision of surgeons performing a triage on a dying giant. The court, once a model of hierarchical order, became a shifting labyrinth of allegiances, where every greeting was assessment, every conversation a potential negotiation, and every silence a threat. The shadow of the Lapis Imperii, now diffuse and omnipresent, worked its poison not through grand acts of betrayal, but through the meticulous, daily cultivation of distrust. It was in the way a garrison commander, loyal to Charles, would suddenly be reassigned to a remote post on the Breton March on the recommendation of an advisor with ties to Pepin. It was in the way funds for Louis's cherished monastic reforms were, accidentally, delayed by imperial treasurers who answered to Charles's faction. It was in the way a gifted bard, known for composing lays praising Pepin's governance in Italy, was found dead of a sudden fever, a death everyone quietly attributed to a subtle poison from an agent of an unknown brother. This was the new warfare, a cold, silent conflict of administrative sabotage and psychological manipulation, each brother testing the other's defenses, probing for weaknesses, and consolidating their power bases with a cold efficiency they had learned from the master himself. Charles the Younger, ensconced in his father's former private chambers which he had unilaterally occupied, began to act with the brash certainty of a man who believed primogeniture was a law of God and nature. He issued directives to the imperial chancery, signing them simply as Charles, the lack of any qualifying title itself a bold claim to supreme authority. His orders were focused on the military and the treasury, the levers of raw power. He began rotating commanders of the border legions, placing men whose loyalty to him was personal and absolute in key positions. He initiated audits of the tax revenues from Aquitaine and Italy, a move transparently designed to assert fiscal control over his brother's domains and uncover any financial improprieties he could use against them. He saw the empire as a single, magnificent sword, and he was determined to be the only hand on the hilt. His nights were spent with his father's maps, but he was not planning defenses against external foes. He was tracing the fastest marching routes from Aachen to Pavia and to Toulouse, calculating supply lines and siege times. The vision that haunted him was not one of betrayal, but of reunification by force, a necessary, bloody surgery to cut away the rot of division before it could spread. Pepin, from his borrowed apartments in a different wing of the vast palace complex, watched his brother's moves with the cool detachment of a master chess player. He did not seek to command the whole board. He sought to secure his own quadrant and make it impregnable. While Charles focused on soldiers and gold, Pepin focused on information and law. His network of agents, cultivated over years of governing complex Lombardy, was far superior to his brother's. He knew of Charles's troop movements before the orders left the scribe's desk. He intercepted copies of the audit requests and had his own Lombard accountants prepare flawless, obfuscating ledgers in response. He held quiet, late-night meetings with the most brilliant legal minds in Aachen, not to claim the throne, but to meticulously build a legalistic fortress around his own title as King of Italy. He researched the old Lombard laws of elective monarchy, the ancient Roman precedents for regional autonomy, and the Church's teachings on the rights of kings. He was preparing a devastating legal and theological defense of his independence, a case so watertight that any move by Charles to subjugate him would be seen as naked aggression against law, tradition, and God. His betrayal would not be one of raised banners, but of secession by statute, a calm, reasoned dissolution of the empire his father had built. Louis, the Pious, was perhaps the most frightening of the three, for he was not playing a game of power but acting in what he believed was a divine tragedy. He retreated to a small, austere cell in the monastery attached to the palace, surrounding himself not with warriors or lawyers, but with the most austere and firebrand clerics he could find. He spent his days in prayer and mortification, scourging his own flesh in a desperate attempt to purify himself and the empire for the crisis he felt was coming. His father's dying words about the Church of the Void had mutated in his sensitive mind into a full-blown apocalyptic vision. He became convinced that his brother's ambitions were not merely political flaws but manifestations of a great spiritual evil, a demonic force that sought to corrupt the Holy Empire into a vehicle for its own purposes. His agents were not spies, they were inquisitors. They sought out rumors of moral corruption in Charles's camp, drunkenness, fornication, impiety. They listened for any hint of pagan sympathy or theological laxity in Pepin's intellectual circle. For Louis, the coming conflict was not a civil war but an exorcism. He began drafting a monumental document, not a claim to the throne, but a capitulary of spiritual renewal, a draconian set of religious laws that would impose a puritanical regime on the entire empire, stripping away what he saw as the worldly decadence that had infected it. He was preparing to not just rule, but to purge, to save his father's realm by scourging it of the very human weaknesses that his father had so brilliantly, and in Louis's eyes, so sinfully, managed. The tension built like pressure behind a dam. The palace functionaries, the counts, the bishops, all were forced to choose sides in a conflict that had not yet been declared. The unified realm began to crack along the fault lines of the three inherited neuroses: Charles's authoritarianism, Pepin's legalistic separatism, and Louis's religious fanaticism. The ghost of Charlemagne was everywhere, not as a benign spirit but as a haunting. His portrait, his laws, his empty throne were constant reminders of the unity that was being dismantled. The brothers would sometimes pass each other in the halls, and the air would grow cold. No words were exchanged, only looks of perfect, incomprehensible misunderstanding. They were no longer siblings. They were opposing forces, living embodiments of the fragmented nightmare their father had foreseen, each believing himself to be the savior of the legacy, each acting in a way that guaranteed its destruction. The shadow had fully possessed them. The first battle of the war had already been fought and won, not with swords, but in the secret chambers of their hearts, where the legacy of a black stone and a dying man's fear had found its most fertile ground. The empire was now a triptych of mutually assured suspicion, and the only thing holding back the bloodshed was the fragile, crumbling inertia of their father's memory. But that memory was fading fast, and the future, the terrible, prophesied future, was ticking towards its hour.